We know there are many choices in internet radio, and the staff and host of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.
The Dialogue, the community voice of Southern California's young professional network. Relevant discussions about the thoughts, concerns, opportunities, and challenges faced by today's generational leaders. Real talk, real people. This is The Dialogue. The Dialogue with Starlett Quarles on LA Talk Live and streaming live at www.latalklive.com.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to The Dialogue. Real talk, real people. I am your host, Starlett Quarles, and we're on live at latalklive.com and streaming all over your internet. So make sure you look for us on ustream.tv and iTunes Radio R&B. Just make sure you put LA Talk Live in the search engine. Tonight we're continuing our month-long series, The Truth About White Privilege. We started this conversation off this month with our conversation on understanding white privilege, and tonight we want to take that conversation to a new elevation with a discussion on white advantage in America with our guests tonight, Jody Armour, Roy P. Crocker, professor of law at USC. He's also the author of Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. Dr. Lynn Jacobs, author of Learning to Love White Shame and Guilt, Skills for Working as a White Therapist in a Racially Divided Country. And Daria Rothmeyer, author, Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage. All here tonight to help me continue my series this month, The Truth About White Privilege. And we have 2 more weeks in our discussion. And next week we're going to be talking about white privilege in education. And we're going to conclude this series with white privilege in the music industry. And you know, we're probably more than likely going to be focusing on hip-hop. So make sure you tune in all month long, every Wednesday from 5 to 6:30 this month with me, talking about the truth about white privilege. And as always, this is a community conversation. So we want to hear from you. 323-473-3100. 323-473-3100. Or you can always post your comments or your questions on our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Dialogue LA, or tweet me at StarQuar. Or if you have my text, my phone, I've been answering your text, so text me here your questions tonight for our conversation on white advantage in America. And you can always visit our website at thedialoguela.com. If you've missed any of our past episodes on this series on white privilege, or even last month's series on the attack on the black man, which kind of spearheaded this series for this month. So make sure you stay connected to us at thedialoguela.com. Now, before I go to commercial break, I want to invite you all to a couple of community events here in Los Angeles, where yours truly is getting honored. It's a very exciting week for me. Thank you, Richard. I'm receiving a couple of awards this week that I'd like to share with you, and hopefully you can come out and support your girl. Tomorrow night, October 16th, the National Action Network Los Angeles is honoring me at the Los Angeles' most influential African Americans celebration. I'll be recognized with over 100 of Los Angeles' community leaders in the African American community, and I'm in the movers and shakers category. So I'm out here moving and shaking, y'all, on the dialogue. And it's also the 60th birthday for Reverend Al Sharpton, who will be in the house. And as you know, he is the founder of the National Action Network. It is his national nonprofit, and the LA chapter is where I will be honored tomorrow, October 13th, at the California African American Museum. The reception meet and greet starts at 6 o'clock, and the award starts at 7. So for more information, please contact Robert Bush at 323-633-7310. And a big thank you and shout out to Reverend K.W. Tulis, Najee Ali, and the family at National Action Network Los Angeles for this honor. Secondly, this Sunday, October 19th, I will also be receiving an award from the Sisters at the Well at their 9th annual We See You Award. So thank you so much for continuing to see me. Shout out to Miss Barbara Perkins, who many of you might remember had a show here on LA Talk Live. So that is this Sunday, October 19th. The VIP reception begins at 4 o'clock, and the award starts at 5, and this is all being held at the Skirball Cultural Center. So for more information, please visit sistersatthewell.com. Now, we are going to take a quick commercial break because I'm very excited about our conversation tonight on white advantage in America. And this is concluding our series this month on the truth about white privilege. Right here with me, Starlett Quarles, on the dialogue. Real talk, real people. We'll be right back.
Spend my life being a color.
Tell me you agree with me when I saw you kicking dirt in my eye. You're thinking about my baby. It don't matter if you're black or white.
We know there are many choices in internet radio, and the staff and hosts of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.
It started out like a totally normal day.
I love you.
I mean, I guess I was a little sweaty and I was definitely sore. I thought I had gas. Turns out I was having a heart attack. Heart disease is the #1 killer of American women. So now I take care of myself and tell the other women in my life to do the same. Make it your mission to save your life and the lives of the women you love. Find out more from the American Heart Association at goredforwomen.org.
Interested in advertising your business, product, or service?
Smart designs, tees and tots for men, women, and boys. Visit XavierUSA.com. Once again, that's XavierUSA.com. Hubert's Lemonade, tasty, refreshing, sweet, and tart. Happiness in a bottle. Visit Hubert's Lemonade at Hubert'sLemonade.com. Once again, that's Hubert'sLemonade.com. Happiness in a bottle.
Welcome back, Richard. You're hilarious. Your music selection is very interesting tonight, so thank you very much. Welcome back to the dialogue, Real Talk, Real People. I'm your host, Starlett Quarles, and we're on live at latalklive.com. And today we are continuing our series this month on the truth about white privilege, and we're taking this conversation up a little bit to talk about white advantage. And our show tonight is White Advantage in America. So we definitely want to hear from you. 323-473-3100, 323-473-3100. I'm very excited about our guests. So let me quickly introduce them because Jody has to leave early. And we all know how much we love Jody's excitement and passion when it comes to anything having to do with racial relations. So tonight we have on our show, for the first time, Dr. Lynn Jacobs, who is the author of a paper published in the International Journal of Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology entitled Learning to Love White Shame and Guilt, Skills for Working as a White Therapist in a Racially Divided Country. She's also the co-founder of the Pacific Gestalt Institute and has long been interested in the relational dimension of psychotherapy and in integrating humanistic theories with contemporary psychoanalytic theories. Please welcome Dr. Lynn Jacobs to the dialogue. Welcome. How are you? You can just move closer to the mic.
Okay.
So glad to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Sitting next to Dr. Jacobs Lynn is Jody Armour, who is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC, authored of many papers and books, the upcoming Nigga Theory, which you shared with us last time you were here. But tonight we want to talk to him about his book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. So please welcome back Professor Jody Armour to the dialogue. Welcome, sir. And I know you have to leave early.
Good to be here. I'm just honored to be here with people like Lynn and Daria, and of course, always you, Starlett.
Oh, so we're going to get to you because I know you have to leave early. So I'm so excited to have you here. So thank you, and thank you for introducing me to Dr. Jacobs. And on the phone,
can call me Lynn.
And Lynn, thank you so much. Okay, to Lynn. And on the phone, we have Daria Rothmeyer, who is a law professor at USC who teaches and writes about the dynamics of law in social systems and focuses on the way that legal regulation and social behavior evolve in response to each other. Her recent book, Reproducing Racism: How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage, explores the self-reinforcing dynamics of persistent racial inequality. So please, on the phone, welcome Miss Daria Rothmeyer. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you just got out of class, so I appreciate you calling in and sharing in on this conversation. So I just want to jump right into it. And Daria, I'm going to start with you with the conversation. What is the dominant narrative when it comes to the conversation around white privilege? I know we're going to get to white advantage, but when we talk about this conversation, especially amongst black people, we use the term white privilege.
So I think the dominant narrative is one in which the conversation about white privilege focuses, for the most part, on those everyday, taken for granted privileges that whites have that they largely aren't even aware of, that black and brown and some Asian groups are all too aware of because they don't enjoy the same privileges.
Okay.
And I think for many, the prototype privilege would be being able to walk around a department store without being followed by the security guards.
Right.
Or to be more concrete about it with regard to people's experiences being stopped by the police, even being stopped by the police to begin with, let alone what happens after they're stopped. There are huge differences in outcome, as we are all too aware of after Ferguson, in terms of how that conversation goes down. So that's the dominant narrative when it comes to the conversation on white privilege with regard to focusing on that sort of thing.
Now, when it comes to, I guess, the voice, I mean, we all have heard of Tim Wise. And so, Lynn, I want to ask you, from your perspective, what is Tim Wise's message, and why do so many white people come to hear him speak?
Tim's message, one of the really strong points about Tim's message is he tries to wake up white people to what they're unaware of about their advantage or their privilege, and about how that is systemic. It's in our education system, it's in the way laws are applied, it's in banking practices, as well as in individual prejudice and even racism. And he's popular, I think, because there are actually a lot of people, white folks in this country, who care about racism, prejudice, and systemic advantage, feel kind of hopeless about it, and his angry talks and angry writing gives them a chance to feel a little bit more empowered about feeling like they can do something.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Daria, what are your thoughts on Tim Wise and his message to white people?
Well, I think I agree largely with what Lynn says in terms of why he's the success he is. I do think there's a way, though, in which the conversation can be skewed and skewed to pay more attention to white privilege than the actual source of that privilege, the relative disadvantage. And that's somewhat of a concern that I have with the rise of the conversation about white privilege and white studies more generally. Is it seems as though the conversation is shifting again to focus on white experience as opposed to the experiences of people of color who don't enjoy that privilege. And that's a note of caution that I would inject, but I would say by and large that to the extent that Tim reaches an audience that a lot of other people, maybe neither Jody nor I could reach, they're not Latino, they're not black audiences, then I'm happy for that conversation.
Well, that's
just so long as it focuses, in addition to privilege, to the lack thereof.
Okay.
Well, that was one of the things that interested me. Is one of the ways I am advantaged is I can speak to white people without them becoming too frightened, defensive, or turning their back on me because I'm white. So the irony is that it's an advantage I have, but I try to use it well.
Okay. Jody, I see you shaking your head.
Wow, you can see I'm just sponging all of this in. I'm absorbing it all because, it's really great to be flanked by two such, kind of incisive and thoughtful people. Daria's book is fabulous, by the way. She's getting ready to have a book celebration and about reproducing racism, how it's reproduced in everyday life without even any conscious animus behind it. And you've heard Lynn's remarks, and her writing is just as penetrating as her remarks so far.
I commend their bravery.
So I'm loving just being here and sponging all of this in. But it's interesting for me to hear Daria's critique of what is otherwise seen as an unambiguously positive project, that is the focus on white privilege, and point out that there are some dangers. That doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile project, an important one we need to go forward with, but that it can shift the focus from the disadvantaged to those of us, with privilege, and to the white experience, and refocus the conversation around, kind of that. And that is risky, but Tim Wise, I'm sorry, I love his stuff. I read his stuff. Lynn Jacobs puts it down. I mean, she's not just standing in his shadow, and she comes at it from a little different angle, but brings these same kinds of penetrating insights, but in a interdisciplinary way that Daria does, and I try to. So I think that's a very interesting critique, and one that I'll think about. I just never thought about as clearly, but had to think about it before Daria, and I like it. I'm gonna have to give that some more thought.
May I say something more about it? I agree with your critique, Daria. I want to suggest, though, that for white people, the more I can explain to them how they don't think about their whiteness, the more they are likely to see people of color as human subjects. Their individual human subjectivity can become something they take more interest in.
Okay, so Daria, help us explain the difference between white privilege and white advantage. And for the duration of the show, we're going to talk about it from the white advantage perspective. But define for us, we kind of talked a little bit about white privilege, but what exactly is white advantage? And give us some examples.
So I would say that that's in some ways the second critique that I have of the conversation about white privilege, is that it tends to distract from a conversation about white advantage. And I don't know that until this radio show I had really focused on drawing that clean a distinction between privilege and advantage. But the way that I think of advantage, and the way that I talk about it in the book, is to think about it structurally and materially. And so while talking about racial profiling is certainly very structural and very material, there are some conversations about white privilege, for example, the conversation about being followed in a store, or being asked where you're from, that focus more on microaggressions, so things that people of color put up with all the time, but that don't have the same sort of impact as the stuff I'm about to talk about. And so when I think about white advantage, structural advantage, I think about the huge and persistent differences in employment rates between whites, blacks, and Latinos, the differences in housing, the differences in political participation, the differences in infant mortality, the differences in education. I could go on. But you see that the difference there is really to focus on structural indicia of people's well-being, their jobs, their schools, their neighborhoods, their voting privileges and abilities. And those, I think, are advantages and then the relative disadvantages of people of color that we really haven't spent nearly enough time talking about, and that the book really tries to refocus the conversation from privilege to advantage in that way.
Excellent. And Jody, before I go, I want to talk about your book. And so, Richard, I'm going to skip forward to Jody because he has to leave early. But your book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Cost of Being Black in America. You talk about the reasonable racist. What is the reasonable racist?
Yeah, well, it's the ordinary person. You know, the reasonable person standard is what's most important in self-defense law. So when you're trying to think about the Trayvon Martin case or the Darren Wilson case in Ferguson, all of them are going to come down to, in the jury's mind, did this person reasonably believe he was about to be attacked by this black person? And to the extent that ordinary people are more afraid of black males than similarly situated white males, then it's going to be considered reasonable to more hastily use lethal force against them in self-defense, or in other ways respond more aggressively to them than similarly situated white males. And so what happens is we wind up blaming, in a sense, George Zimmerman for his wrongful act in relation to Trayvon Martin without blaming the cultural belief system and set of stereotypes that made him fear a big, strapping, young black man more than a similarly situated white male. So the jury wound up saying, and then we all act confused when it happens, that I see myself in George and George in myself. I can't condemn somebody who's just like me, and the reasonable person test asks me to do that. The reasonable person test says, if you sympathize with the defendant, acquit. And that's what they do. So we need to start thinking of the George Zimmerman cases and the Ferguson cases and other cases like those, not just as problems of individual wrongdoers where we're going to reduce it to the personal pathology of George Zimmerman or Darren Wilson, but rather as a problem of social stereotypes, a part of our cultural belief system, and that they're going to be coming up again and again in all kinds of situations until we get a handle on that.
So make the parallel between racism, prejudice, and how that all connects to a white advantage.
Oh, yeah. Well, just very briefly, and I thought that Daria gestured at this nicely, that her, a lot of her work is focusing on structural racism, and a lot of my earlier stuff in Negrophobia focused on the kind of racism that comes from people's stereotypes about blacks.
Right.
So they make decisions about them, they profile them, they respond to them differently. Jesse Jackson said, hey, wait a minute, nothing more pains me at this point in my life. Walk down the street, start hearing suspicious footsteps, turn around, seeing someone white and feeling relieved. That's that microaggression level where stereotypes work that Daria was talking about. What structural racism is even if tomorrow we got up and nobody had any racial discrimination against blacks whatsoever, unconsciously or even consciously, if that all went away, there's still enough structural legacies of historic racism around that you'd have a lot of racial discrimination perpetuating itself in the form of economic discrimination, like Daria was pointing out, bad schools, where you live, the neighborhoods would be bad. You're in a Rust Belt city with no jobs because they've all went south or overseas. All those structural factors would perpetuate racial inequalities even without any kind of prejudice.
Okay, and now you mentioned this four quadrant. Richard, if you could show that four quadrant.
See, I used that in my article. You didn't know that.
See, she gave you props.
Right on.
but it was very interesting, to how you kind of paralleled this four quadrant as it relates to racism and prejudice. So just kind of walk us through this quadrant really quickly,
go ahead,
Lynn, and just how it relates to white advantage.
Yeah. So here's well, I hope I can relate it to white advantage. But here's the deal. So Jody did this quadrant where he talked about you can have people with high racism and high prejudice. And for me, I say there's no point in talking to white people who are in that category because they're not interested. Actually, Jody says it too in his book. Then there's low racism, high prejudice. Those are people you can talk to because they care about their prejudice because they don't want to be racist. And then there's low racism, high prejudice. And when I teach, that's where I situate myself because I'm having to cope with prejudice every day, but it matters to me. And then there's finally low racism. Oh, I had two in the same. I drew the same thing here.
Oh, no. But
then there's,
we get the concept.
Then there's high racism,
typo,
low prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to talk to those people either. There's no point.
Okay.
So to me, this helped us focus on helping white people unpack their prejudices if they care to.
Okay, excellent. And Jody, really quickly before you go, I want you to talk about this concept in your book called the black tax.
Oh yeah.
And as it relates to the negative stereotypes that white people have on, we have to pay a tax for this that you call. So define it. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from your paper.
Yeah, well, I call the black tax the price black folks pay in America because of negative stereotypes about them, conscious or unconscious. Especially the unconscious ones can be vexing, but conscious or unconscious. So being profiled by not being able to go shopping without sprouting a shadow in the form of security personnel, not getting tennis elbow damn near trying to flag down a cab because one won't stop as you're waving away. All those are, but also what happened to arguably Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin were expressions of the black tax as well. The people who applied lethal force to them were doing so, perhaps it seems strongly likely that at least unconsciously, if not consciously, race played a role in their assessment of the dangerousness of the person they used deadly force on. And so that was an application of the black tax. So the black tax is ubiquitous. It comes out of both statistical differences in crime rates between blacks and whites, that's statistically rational discrimination, if you will, and it comes from unconscious bias buried in the cognitive unconscious.
Okay, so I want to read a little bit from Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism around this black tax. It says here, the black tax comes in many varieties. Reports abound of blacks being stopped and interrogated by police for walking or jogging through white neighborhoods. Police are often responding to calls from concerned neighbors. Although Furman-style racism may lie behind such calls and stops, it is quite possible that these watchful callers and dutiful officers see themselves as responding reasonably to a person who seems to be out of place. Nothing personal. Likewise, it's nothing personal when store security personnel shadow blacks in department stores. Nothing personal when clerks refuse to buzz blacks into jewelry stores at glitzy Manhattan boutiques, and when white women balk at getting on empty elevators with black, but not white, men. Nothing personal, moreover, in profile stops of blacks by drug enforcement officers. Nothing personal in redlining black neighborhoods by everything from banks to pizza delivery services. And positively, nothing personal in the mountain of empirical evidence of racial discrimination in the administration of justice. Without a doubt, the shibboleth of today's apologists for the black tax is nothing personal. What can be done about the black tax? Haven't we paid enough?
Hey, at the end of the day, I say the silver lining in the black tax is the black Brahmins, the black bourgeoisie loathes and despises the black tax. They're always railing against the black tax. They call it the rage of the privileged class. Ellis Coase had a book out about it. And they hate being mistaken for low-income blacks who are involved in more criminal behavior, right? That's what they really hate.
Right.
So what I'm telling, the silver lining in the black tax for me is, as long as blacks are disproportionately concentrated in desperate, poor circumstances, they're going to turn disproportionately to desperate undertakings like crime. That's just human nature. So if you want to do something about the black tax, black bourgeoisie, reach down and help pull truly disadvantaged blacks out of their disadvantage. Channel a lot of your time, energy, and resources toward that, because you took flights from their neighborhood as soon as Shelley Kramer and other legal cases allowed you to start entering white neighborhoods. There was a mass exodus of the middle-class blacks. Julius Wilson talks about this. A mass exodus of the black middle class from those neighborhoods into what used to be white neighborhoods, leaving a lot of concentrated disadvantage behind. So the black bourgeoisie needs to do something about that concentrated disadvantage we left behind when we moved into View Park and Baldwin Hills and Windsor Hills and Ladera Heights. That's what so the black tax has that silver lining. As long as they don't look good, we don't look good, and their fates are wedded to ours.
We're about to go to commercial break, but before we do, what is your message for black people when it comes to the conversation about white advantage? Why do we need to understand that white advantage exists?
Yeah, because it's the flip side of racial discrimination. It's almost the mirror image. Although it may be, I'd be interested. I wish I could stay around for this to hear what to hear what Lynn and Daria would have to say about the difference between white advantage and white supremacy, or white privilege and white supremacy. Are they the same? Are they different? You know.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much. We're going to take a quick commercial break, Richard. Love you so much, Jody. Please come back and talk to us. We're talking about white advantage in America here on The Dialogue. When we come back, we're going to get back into our conversation with Professor Rothmeyer on her book and talk a little bit more about white advantage. Also here with Dr. Lynn Jacobs. We'll take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back.
Concentrate and open up your mind. Brown lady, you gotta spread the news around. Brown lady, don't you let your people down. Don't you let them down. I only wanna take a few minutes of your time. Try and concentrate and open up your mind. Oh, Now you all heard a story. Now come on and listen to the truth. Brown lady, you gotta spread the news.
It started out like a totally normal day.
I love you.
I mean, I guess I was a little sweaty and I was definitely sore. I thought I had gas. Turns out I was having a heart attack. Heart disease is the #1 killer of American women. So now I take care of myself and tell the other women in my life to do the same. Make it your mission to save your life and the lives of the women you love. Find out more from the American Heart Association at goredforwomen.org.
Hubert's Lemonade, tasty, refreshing, sweet, and tart. Happiness in a bottle. Visit Hubert's Lemonade at hubertslemonade.com. Once again, that's hubertslemonade.com. Happiness in a bottle.
Interested in advertising your business, product, or service here on The Dialogue? Call 323-547-7748. The Dialogue will help you promote your business, increase your traffic, and bring in new clients through innovative and creative marketing packages, including affordable radio ad campaigns for small businesses. Find out more. Call 323-547-7748. That's 323-547-7748. Or go to www.thedialoguela.com. And now, back to The Dialogue. The Dialogue with Starlett Quarles. Real talk, real people.
The dark brown shades of my skin only add color to my tears. Oh, that's
welcome back to The Dialogue, Real Talk, Real People. I'm your host, Starlett Quarles, and we're on live at latalklive.com. And tonight we are continuing our month-long conversation on the truth about white privilege. And tonight's conversation is on a concept called white advantage. And our show is White Advantage in America. And joining us, we have in studio Dr. Lynn Jacobs, and on the phone, Daria Rothmeyer. Daria, are you still with us?
Yes.
Excellent. So you say in your book, racial inequality reproduces itself automatically from generation to generation. Please explain how.
So the book focuses on what I call positive feedback loops. And there are these structural processes that have to do with kind of the everyday way in which capitalism works that end up reproducing a lot of racial inequality. So let me give you some specific examples.
Okay.
So think about the way in which people pass down wealth. So parents pass their wealth down to their kids in 2 or 3 different ways. One of those is that they give them an inheritance when they die, but they also give them help with a college education, and they give them money frequently for a down payment on a house. And both of those things, owning a home and getting a college education, are ways to acquire more wealth.
Right.
And so if you start with a group of people who have, for historical reasons, enjoyed additional wealth coming from slavery and Jim Crow. So white families enjoyed the benefits of profits from plantations and then higher wages because they excluded people of color from labor markets during Jim Crow. So they have more money. So that money gets passed down to their kids, who are then able to earn even more money with it.
Okay.
And families of color don't have that additional wealth, can't give their kids the money for a down payment on a house or a college education. And researchers suggest that 22% of the wealth gap between black families and white families comes from these wealth differences in what gets passed down from parent to child. And so in the book, I talk about family networks, I talk about neighborhood networks in which public schools are the way in which white neighborhoods pass down advantage to the next generation. I talk about social networks in which giving people a referral for a job, vouch for somebody when the boss calls to say, what do you know about this person? Or to even refer them to the job in the first place. That's a way of spreading the wealth and passing it down both over time to your children, but also to other people in your social network. And then I talk about institutional networks in which whites benefit because they were the first to occupy an institution, and the folks who are making choices about who comes into the institution next, whether it's who gets into universities or who gets hired for a job, they tend to be disproportionately white people who end up disproportionately choosing white people to fill their shoes. And so all of these networks operate even if intentional discrimination were to end tomorrow. Those family networks, neighborhood networks, social networks, and institutional networks would reproduce racial inequality, and I dare say we wouldn't see much of a difference in employment rates, in housing rates, in education rates, and in institutional participation, because these networks keep racial inequality alive.
Excellent. Lynn, would you agree? I mean, you said you grew up in a rich community. Would that be true for you, growing up white in America?
Well, yes, it would be true for me. I have one question for Daria, if I could ask it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Daria, I'm thinking about when you say if racism was gone, the inequalities would still be there. But what I'm thinking about is the research by the Pew Research Center about sending out curriculum vitaes for jobs, and how people get asked back for the job if their name looks white, and they don't get asked back for interviews if their name looks black.
Oh, wow.
So if we were able to get rid of prejudice, let's say, do you not think that could help begin to make the difference in that cycle of white wealth perpetuating white wealth and white jobs perpetuating white jobs?
I do think it could make a difference, but it's a question of how much of a difference.
Yeah.
And I dare say that the vast majority of the reason that people of color aren't in high-wage jobs that have opportunity for advancement has relatively little to do with the phenomenon that you're describing, and a much, much larger fraction has to do with the kind of educations that they're getting, the kind of referrals that they're getting from neighbors and people in their social networks, and the institutional processes by which those who are first in the job choose those who will succeed them. I think that captures a far larger portion of employment differences than differences in names. But I totally agree with you that continues to happen. Intentional discrimination is still a part of the way we distribute jobs. But even if we were able to get rid of that, I would say that it would make a very small dent in the kind of job differences that you would see.
So for people of color, it really is about, say, for instance, who you know.
Well, that's right.
But for white people, it's just generationally, they know the right people.
That's right. I mean, when you asked about it being me, the people I know in my life are by and large white people. So those are the names I'm going to give to somebody saying, hey, I need to hire somebody.
Right. Okay.
And those folks are more likely to have owing to historical discrimination, high-wage jobs that have an opportunity for advancement. And so those are the kinds of jobs that will get passed around in white networks.
That's right.
There's a really interesting study coming out of the UK in which they look at wealthy white families, fathers and sons. And when you look at the very wealthiest of those white families, 70% of sons end up working for an employer that the father either currently is employed by or was employed by in the past. 70%.
Wow.
And I dare say the number would be relatively high in the U.S. as well.
Excellent.
So that's the kind of wealth that's getting passed down, the opportunity to work at a high-wage job with an opportunity for advancement.
And on the flip side of that, for people of color, disadvantage is being passed down intergenerationally.
Exactly.
Well, that's right. And with the wealth gap increasing, guess who's going to pay the biggest price for that?
Okay. So you talk about this lock-in model. So explain what the lock-in model is and how it's used to, I guess, justify the white advantage ideology, the lifestyle, and expectations that continue to be passed down intergenerationally for white people.
Well, so the way that I describe the lock-in model is with an analogy to something that people are relatively familiar with, and that is the monopoly advantage that Microsoft enjoys with regard to their operating system, so like Windows. And it's a story that we can tell by focusing on the bad behavior that Microsoft engaged in once upon a time, a long time ago. And they engaged in bad behavior through making sure that their operating system was loaded onto certain computers and that the computer manufacturers wouldn't load other people's operating systems on their computers. And that illegal behavior gave Microsoft a small but important advantage in operating systems. So the more people chose Windows, the more software authors wrote software for Windows, and then the more software authors that people wrote for Windows, the more consumers bought Windows. And so the advantage that Microsoft had, which started out a relatively small advantage, snowballed, even in the absence of ongoing bad behavior. So Microsoft stopped behaving badly, and even in the absence of any innovation. It wasn't any better of a product, but because more software authors were writing, more consumers bought, and because more consumers bought, more software authors wrote. And at some point, Microsoft's operating system became so powerful that its advantage was locked in. And we say that it was locked in because what we mean is that competitors couldn't possibly catch up. There was no way that a competitor could break into the market because Microsoft had captured all the software authors and all the consumers that came with the software authors, which bred more software authors. And this notion of being locked in because of these network connections is one that I think applies very much to the kinds of networks that I was discussing earlier. That is, those family networks, neighborhood networks, social networks, and institutional networks, in much the same way that Microsoft's advantage became locked in, have locked in white people's advantage to the point where, absent some significant government intervention to do differently the way that we distribute jobs and housing and schools and educations, etc., that absent some significant government intervention or change in the way we do business, those advantages will be locked in indefinitely.
Excellent. So we talk about this intergenerational wealth that was passed down from slavery and then from Jim Crow. So, but in terms of the conversation about slavery, why is it still an elephant in both the black and white community? And Lynn educated me because I was saying pink elephant, but pink is if you're drunk. So it's still an elephant in the room. So, but Lynn, so why is the conversation around slavery? I mean, even though we see all these movies, Django and all this type of, it's still very uncomfortable for black and white people. Why is that?
Well, I don't know why it is for black people.
I don't know why we're not talking about it.
But I know for white people, first of all, they get to use the excuse that most of us who are white people now are children of immigrants who weren't here during slavery. So we get to say it wasn't our fault. But that ignores what Daria's pointing out about how much benefit we still get to derive from the legacy of slavery. But one of the things I think that frightens whites is if they begin to truly look at the inescapable advantage that they have, the guilt and and sense of rue and shame and sadness would be overwhelming to them, and they would realize, for instance, in the reparations talk, that they could never offer reparations that could possibly make up for all that's done unless actually they're willing to give up something major like easy access to jobs. And it's too overwhelming for them. I don't think they can face it.
So I want to read from your paper, Learning to Love, White Shame and Guilt, Skills for Working as a White Therapist in a Racially Divided Country. You talk about the legacy of slavery. You say here, most white people who are alive today are children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have arrived in America after slavery has ended. They tend to absolve themselves of responsibility for the problems of institutional, structural, and personal inequalities that abound. They ignore the fact that they have come to be seen as Americans, whereas black fellow citizens remain other. What is the legacy of slavery that white America just refuses to want to discuss even today?
What I said before didn't answer that. But I want to pick up on that thing about American and other. We talk about black Americans. We don't talk about white Americans. We just talk about Americans. This, to me, I realize it's small potatoes, Daria, compared to what you're looking at. But to me, it's very important that when a white person says the word American, they're referring to a white person and universalizing it. They don't say American and think black or some other person of color. That, to me, is one of the things that keeps some of the institutionalized problems in place.
Daria, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with that. I would say it's not small potatoes because it explains why we don't care about wealth gaps and job gaps and housing gaps.
Okay. In continuing with this conversation on slavery and the perceptions and images of black people, specifically black women, you say another example of how the effect of slavery, the slavery industry insinuates itself into a current consciousness is its attitude towards black sexuality. It was during the slavery times and the Reconstruction era that the ideas about black sexuality, especially in relation to whiteness, were developed, and they still exist today. During slave times, white slaveholders and family members and employees could rape black slave women with impunity. Self-serving mythology arose among whites that while white wives were chaste, black women were desirous sirens who lured white husbands into sex. So talk about whites' attitude towards blacks' sexuality and how it's still being manifested today.
Well, actually, white women, I think, have a lot of ambivalence about, I should say white straight women have a lot of ambivalence about straight black men. On the one hand, there's a kind of a romantic vision of a black man, and I don't mean that hypersexualized image. That's the negative. The negative is the hypersexualized black man who wants to rape you. And that really comes from the slavery days. But there's also this romanticized vision of almost black-white reconciliation that can happen through tender love between a white woman and a black man. That's a fantasy that shows up in a lot of romance literature, for instance. So there's
I don't read romance novels, really?
Me neither. But when I was a teenager, I read a book called 5 White Stones. That was very moving to me, and it was a book about a white teenage girl and a black teenage boy and their budding romance, if you will. So it was the closest thing I ever came to a romance novel, but it's in romance novels.
Excellent. So when we talk about bringing it fast forward to when we talk about instances with Mike Brown and these killings of unarmed black men, our conversation last month was the attack on the black man. So I want to ask both of you ladies, do you feel like there is an attack on the black man?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Why?
I have no doubt about it. And I'll go first, and then Daria, you'll come in, I guess, afterwards. But there's a couple of things I want to say about that. One is white employers are afraid of the strength of black men.
Physically?
Yes, physically, but also black men who keep their dignity about them pose a kind of emotional threat to a white boss. But there's something else that both white men and white women have, and that's a physical fear of black men. And my example of that is, for instance, the white woman getting in an elevator. We are raised with all those images in the media about black violence so that around a black man, growing up in that, our bodies learn to tense up around black men.
Okay.
So then guess what? Then the black man's body tenses up because bodily tensions and relaxations are infectious with each other if you're in proximity. So then the black man tenses up. So then the white woman tenses up even more. It's a visceral, bodily, largely unconscious set of reactions. But it puts black men then under attack because they're being seen as vicious when all they did was get in an elevator and a white woman, based on years of unconscious training, became tense.
What would you say, Daria? Daria,
Well,
I'm sorry.
No problem. It's actually Daria, if you can roll your R. But I'm
Daria.
not gonna-
Daria.
So-
We're going to get it together, girl.
There you go. So I would say two things. One, I want to preface what I'm about to say with regard to the attack on the black man by noting that I was part of a group spearheaded by Kim who objected when My Brother's Keeper and other programs that were specifically focused at the black man failed to take into account the needs for black women as well. And I think
you said you
looking at
objected
Kim's
to
work, you understand immediately why we shouldn't pay attention to one at the expense of the other. So I want to say that up front.
Okay.
So there's a danger in thinking about this question in that way because it justifies things like My Brother's Keeper. But second, I would say that looking at incarceration rates, you understand immediately, like nothing else, when you just look at the racial composition of the prison population, that anybody who thinks that black men aren't being singled out would have a hard time explaining those racial disparities and gender disparities. And there's a sociologist by the name of Loïc Vacan who's done amazing work in which he suggests that the reason that there's been such an increase in the prison population with regard to black and Latino men, for that matter, has to do with how we manage the shift in our economy, the shift that produces this loss of low-skilled labor. It's all gone overseas or it's been replaced by technology. And those folks were once managed by the ghetto and the hyper-ghetto as the middle class moved out in the way that Jody mentioned. But now society's turned to the prison as a way of managing those who are displaced economically, and you see that. And I think Loïc's work, by the way, this is probably heresy to say this, but I think it's a much more nuanced explanation than Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow book, because she says this is all sort of conspiracy. But I think it really has to do as much with the economy and in managing displaced black workers, black and Latino workers, who tend to be disproportionately male. Those are the folks who are being displaced. Those folks who worked in the low-wage factories are now, in some sense, they're the victims of the displacement. So they're the ones who are rounded up in disproportionate arrests and then disproportionately convicted for crimes that were disproportionately targeting black men in the first place. And I think you have to understand it at a much more structural level in order to get the true scope of the picture. But I definitely think that if you were to look only at disproportionate incarceration rates, anybody who didn't think that there was something particular going on with the black man would really have a hard time explaining.
Can I ask a way to make this really simple and see if it fits what you're saying, Daria? Is like we're more willing to spend money on prisons than we are on job retraining,
or on schools or education.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
And so when you talk about these the black man and the specific attack on the black man, I mean, what specifically do they fear? I mean, when you see someone who's unarmed, like Mike Brown, or you have this mass incarceration of black men, is it a physical threat? I mean, my guest from last month said, there's going to be a rebellion, or there's going to be a new revolution, and if you keep them down, then they won't be able, to attack. So what specifically do they fear when it comes to the black man?
Again, I'm thinking psychologically here, whereas Daria thinks structurally. But psychologically, there was recently just a study reported in the LA Times recently that if you show people a series of black faces and then you show an ambiguous photograph, a fuzzy photograph, white people are likely to see a gun in the photograph. If they show a series of white faces and that same fuzzy photograph, they don't find a gun.
Wow.
So when you say unarmed black men, I'm thinking whites don't see that.
Okay. Right. It's very, it's subconscious.
It's a set of expectations that they work from instead of taking the time to really see the person.
And so how does white America's image and perception of black people, how is that impacting us and how we see ourselves in terms of just the negative influence? I mean, because I see it within my own community. I mean, in terms of just images of black women, images of black families, but even from the white perspective.
Look at the colorist ideas that you have in the black community. I mean, that's a sign right there.
What do you mean by colorist ideas?
Well, if you're, I feel sort of embarrassed saying this, but if you're black, get back.
Oh, okay.
You know, if you're brown, you could move more to the front.
Okay.
And the research that was done about black and white dolls, I think it was Gordon Allport who did that research.
I remember that, yeah.
Well, there's recent studies, and it's still happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just in the psychology of just our black youth. I mean, we also often talk about just our lack of cultural competency.
Well, there's actually a study also that was done in Chicago in the 60s about which black families who were trying to cope with what was called the eugenic effects of poverty. Okay, that was what it was called in the study. How did the black families that remained healthy stay healthy? There were 3 variables involved. One is these black families taught their kids they were special, they had an extended kinship network, and they had an attitude that said, what you were talking about, don't take it personally.
Right.
Their attitude was, suck it up and go on.
Okay.
So there is a kind of, this is where black power was so important, a kind of ethnic pride to try to defend against the corrosive effects of you always walking around in a world of unwelcoming eyes. I walk around in a world of at least neutral, if not welcoming eyes.
Okay.
You don't.
Right.
So you've got to try 3 times as hard just to keep your head up.
Okay, excellent. Before we get to the end of the hour, I want both you ladies to kind of share your story, especially as it relates to this work around white advantage. And Daria, I want to start with you. How did you get into this type of research, and what has white people's response been to you?
Well, so I got into this research in large part because of my family history. My mother's from Mexico City, so I'm Latina. And I grew up in Mississippi in the 60s. And so race has been very much on my mind in one form or other because of my family history and because of where I grew up. And living in Los Angeles in many ways opens up a whole new set of experiences to draw from. But I got into this work in large part because as a critical race theorist, I was part of a conversation in which we often talked about the way in which the system seems structured to reproduce racial inequality, but we really didn't have a way of theorizing. How do we explain how that happens? We know that slavery and Jim Crow are connected to current disparities, but how exactly does that happen? And that motivated the book, and it took much longer than it should have, but it was really difficult to trace out exactly how these networks were working. The way in which whites respond to the work is interesting. So there's a group of people who, in many ways, you're just never going to convince,
right?
And they have the predictable response, the Fox News response, I would call it, to the work, and it's.
But what's disturbing for me is Fox News is the most extreme.
For what I call the crossover vote. So that group of people who haven't really thought about the structural advantage, the way in which their families, neighborhoods, social networks, and institutions have really contributed in large part to their success. And they find it more persuasive, and they find it at some level, and I'm ambivalent about this, less threatening, because the story that I tell locates the bad behavior back during Jim Crow and slavery, and then the story going forward is a story that really points the finger at capitalism, and that enabling them to position themselves as the beneficiaries, but not necessarily the wrongdoers, is something that makes it easier for some whites, that crossover voter group, to really be open to what it is that I'm saying and be convinced.
It's less threatening because it's coming from you?
No, it's less threatening because the because the wrongdoers are in the past.
Okay, all right. So they kind of distance themselves from their historical relevance as it relates
as
to
my grandparents or my grandparents. But not me.
Right. I love black people. I got one black friend. Right. Okay. And so tell us your story. So how did you become so passionate about this line of conversation?
Okay, I'll have to tell you that when I was 11-year-old, President Kennedy had just been elected. And I wrote him a letter saying I wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore, which had that line at the end, liberty and
justice for all?
Yeah, justice for all part, because blacks still couldn't vote in the South.
Wow.
And I grew
this
up
is at 11.
At 11, yeah. But see, I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C., where I was quite aware of the difference between being in the very resourced Montgomery County, Maryland, and the under-resourced, almost all black Washington, D.C. area. My parents were aware of it. They were working for open housing in our area at the time. So conversations about social justice, especially in regards to race, were part of the milk I was raised on, actually. And it remains a big topic of conversation in my family. So it feels to me as natural as breathing does.
Okay.
You know, which is why, in a way, I've told you I've been insulted when white people ask me why I'm so interested in it.
I was going to say, how do they respond to you?
Because, well, I think that our racial issues, especially the way Daria is laying them out, is a cancer in our society. So I don't understand why all white people aren't absolutely passionate about trying to remedy this problem.
I mean, you said you felt kind of like an outsider. I mean, to a certain extent, the more you talk about it, the more people stereotype you that this is your dominant narrative, your message.
That's right.
That now they're trying to push you out the white group.
That's
like
right.
You're not one of us.
Right. The more I speak up about this, the more I risk becoming non-white.
Okay.
And we get taught how to be white. And one of the ways you're supposed to be white is to have your advantage remain invisible. Since I keep making it visible, I'm pushing myself out to the boundaries of non-white, and I'm uncomfortable there, I have to say.
You're uncomfortable?
I like being white.
I like being black.
There's a lot of advantage to being white.
You know what? I commend your honesty. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Last week we played an episode of a gentleman who was on Oprah. I think in 1997 they did this experiment where they changed his skin to black.
Yes,
and
he wanted out before.
He couldn't last a week.
That's
he could not last a week.
That's right. I love that, and I wish more people knew about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick commercial break, Richard, and when we come back, we're going to talk about, does white guilt really exist? And there's some solutions. Dr. Jacobs Lynn and Daria have some solutions as to how we can leverage this white advantage, better understand white advantage, and come to some sense of racial equality. I mean, I don't know if it's going to ever happen in our lifetime, but they definitely, she said nope, but they definitely have some suggestions as to what we can do, hopefully for the next generation. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we're going to conclude our conversation with the white advantage in America. Right here with me, Starlett Quarles on The Dialogue. We'll be right back.
Will you sell cats of madness to the neighborhood little ghetto boy? You already know how rough life can be. 'Cause you're seeing so much pain and misery. Little ghetto boy, your daddy was blown away. He robbed that grocery store. Don't you know that was a sad, sad old day?
How you living? This is D. Brex, your host of the all-new rap project here on LA Talk Live. That's latalklive.com. Or you can find me on iTunes Radio in the R&B section. That's the Rap Project, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's Wednesdays at 7 p.m. West Coast time, so don't be late. On the Rap Project, I will be playing the very best of rap and hip-hop that goes beyond the ordinary. So connect with me, your host, D. Brax, the rap connoisseur, on the Rap Project every Wednesday at 7, right here on latalklive.com, where we are more than just talk.
Hi, this is Tika Lark Fleming inviting you to join me every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for MP Chronicle Presents The Black Girl Show. Join us as we discuss politics, pop culture, and the other side of Black LA. So don't forget to tune in to MP Chronicle Presents The Black Girl Show every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, exclusively on latalklive.com. You can also catch us on iTunes Radio R&B or watch us on Ustream.tv. Reality radio handcrafted for your listening pleasure. This is LA Talk Live, and we are more than just talk.
Interested in advertising your business, product, or service here on The Dialogue? Call 323-547-7748. The Dialogue will help you promote your business, increase your traffic, and bring in new clients through innovative and creative marketing packages, including affordable radio ad campaigns for small businesses. Find out more. Call 323-547-7748. That's 323-547-7748. Or go to www.thedialoguela.com. And now, back to The Dialogue. The Dialogue with Starlett Quarles. Real talk, real people.
Welcome back to the Dialogue, Real Talk, Real People. Tonight we are continuing our month-long series, The Truth About White Privilege, and tonight's conversation is white advantage in America. And for the next half hour of the show, we definitely kind of want to talk about some solutions and what can be done, if anything can be done, to remedy white advantage and inequality in America. Our guests tonight include Dr. Lynn Jacobs, who is the author of Learning to Love, White Shame and Guilt, Skills for Working as a White Therapist in a Racially Divided Country, and Miss Daria Rothmeyer, author of Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage. So before the commercial break, I alluded to the fact that does white guilt, I've asked the question, does white guilt even exist? And if so, what does it look like in America?
Okay, I take it that's directed at me. I'm your white informant for the evening.
You are our spy.
Although, actually, black people know whites much better than white people know whites.
Really? You think
Sure.
so?
Because you have to learn our ways in order to navigate the world. We don't have to learn our ways.
Okay.
It's in our bones.
Okay.
We're raised in it more.
Fair enough.
And strategically, you better figure us out.
Absolutely. Okay, you
right.
hear that. We can teach
Okay.
you some game tonight on how to figure white folks out. Okay.
So, yeah, I would say white guilt exists, and it's.
What are you guilty about? Are you guilty about slavery?
No.
Okay. Ooh.
No.
What you guilty about?
I'm ashamed, actually, about slavery. But, see, I want to distinguish between guilt feelings and living guiltily situated.
Okay, very good.
Because people run from their guilty feelings. If they can be encouraged to see their guilty feelings and their shame as inspirations about their values and trying to live by their values, then they can do this thing that I call paying attention to being guiltily situated, which, Daria, you may not like this because I do think it makes it easier for white people to deal with this. I talk about something called social location. Is now the time I should...
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And social location is this idea that we're all located somewhere along a continuum, more or less centrally. And the centrally socially located folks, and that would be white folks in this conversation, have the greatest access to resources and supports. And they also have the least knowledge about themselves. People who live on the margins know about themselves and know about the people who are centrally socially located, because much of their access to resources goes through those who are centrally socially located. So white people are the ones who are most ignorant about race and race issues in our country. And they're most ignorant about their advantage. But when I teach them, if they understand that that has to do with their social location rather than some morally defective racist self, then they can face their racism. They can understand that it's because they're inevitably, inescapably racistly situated in a racist society.
Interesting.
And that allows them to use those bits of shame and guilt that they feel as inspirations, where they can face up honestly to, yes, I chose to live in a white neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier. It's more resourced. I don't have the tension of cross-cultural differences to deal with. They can face that better.
Okay. Lydia, what is your response? Your thoughts?
I think about this as a function of two things that we've been spending a lot of time talking about today. One is unconscious bias.
Yeah.
And it's hard to feel guilty for what your unconscious does.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, structural racism. And in the way that I've described it, you can locate a lot of the blame for that in slavery and Jim Crow. And as I described later, it's more difficult to feel guilty for what your grandparents and great-grandparents do.
Right.
And then to feel guilty for being a beneficiary of a system that allows families to give wealth to their kids, and public schools get organized around neighborhood wealth as opposed to coming from a central state pot. That's all outside the control of most people who aren't policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think guilt is in many ways to me not as productive a way to think about it as white defensiveness, in a
Yes.
sense,
Okay.
or lack of defensiveness.
Yes.
So those who are defensive want to dismiss the possibility that even if they're not directly guilty, they're beneficiaries of being in this central social location, to use Lynn's phrase. And then and that's because I think people want their hard work recognized. And so the most common response is, I worked hard to get where I am.
That's right.
I didn't benefit from family networks, from social networks, from neighborhood networks, from institutional networks. I did this myself.
Okay.
And that, I think, is a pretty natural response to having folks point out the fact that you were born on third base.
Right.
And then those folks who aren't defensive are more open to that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
When you line up what it is that they get as a beneficiary, a white beneficiary, families, if you point out, did you get a college education paid for? Yes. There's this exercise that I know a lot of people do in which you ask people to take steps forward or steps back, and you never mention race, but you talk about all the structural advantages. So take a step forward if you got a college education paid for. Take a step forward if your parents owned their home.
Right.
Take a step back if you have people in your family who spend time in the criminal justice system. Without ever mentioning race, people sort themselves very quickly. And those folks who are at the front of the line, who are inevitably white males, can choose to respond by either being defensive or by not being defensive, and to the extent that they feel badly about being the front of the line, maybe you can describe it as guilt, but I again tend to think of it as less about guilt and more about being open to being aware.
Well, I think that's really a good point, and that's what I try to teach when I teach about guilt, that when I hear white people say they feel guilty, they're avoiding something.
Okay.
When they recognize that they are guiltily situated and they're happy to take that advantage and run with it, that's more of what, Daria, you're talking about being open to being aware.
Okay. So you're a socially conscious, aware white person. So are you conscious? Are you always constantly thinking about your white advantage and when you're benefiting from it and when you're not?
I would say I wake up and it's one of the first thoughts I have.
What do you wake up and say, I'm white today, I'm advantaged?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I have the
Do you really? That's what you say?
I have the privilege, if you will, of waking up white in a very safe neighborhood and going out for a morning run. And when I'm listening to NPR radio on my run, I actually listen consciously as a person of color. Because if you do that, you start realizing how exclusionary even the most innocent-sounding NPR discussions are. I can give you an example if you want.
Give me an example, yeah.
Okay, so they're talking about the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Steinbeck novel, Grapes of Wrath.
Okay.
And the interviewer says, I understand that although it was well received at the time, there was also a lot of problems with it, and there were even book burnings. People were against it. people were against it. And the interviewee, who was a scholar about Steinbeck, says, yes, people couldn't believe there was that much poverty in America. And I'm listening as a person of color at the time, and I feel like I've been kicked in the stomach.
Okay.
Because the interviewer should have said, white readers seem to have, some of them, a reaction that was so negative that they burned the books, which would have clued the interviewee into saying, yes, white people couldn't imagine that much poverty in America. Because, come on, black people knew poverty in America.
Yeah, we still do.
So that simple little statement that seems so innocent if you're listening as a white person is exclusionary of a large part of our population now, because so many of our population now are people of color.
Daria, would you think white people are oblivious to their advantage, that they wake up and just automatically know?
Would I say that most people are
most white people are they oblivious? Are they oblivious to their advantage?
I think so.
Yes.
It's the old saw about a fish waking up in water and not really being able to take themselves out of the fishbowl to see what it is that they're swimming in. And I think because it's such a taken for granted set of advantages, what do you mean? How else would we distribute wealth?
Right.
Of course, parents are going to give their kids money for a college education. I can't imagine it otherwise.
Right.
That's an ordinary part of their day and an ordinary part of their understanding of social configurations. And so they're I think most of us are oblivious to ways in which people's lives are structured or configured that are different from ours. We just can't imagine anything other than what we know.
Right. So are white people raised to believe that are taught that they're better than everybody else?
Okay, I knew you were going to ask that question. And I want to give you an example of a prejudice that I had.
Okay.
That I was confronted by and appalled by. The Anita Hill hearings are taking place, and there's this very large, very dark black man sitting at the table with her. He looked like the kind of guy you would think was a football player. And I looked at him, and then he started speaking.
That's Charles Ogletree, the lawyer.
Thank you. He was the smartest person in the room, and I was surprised. Okay?
You were surprised because he was black?
Yes. Yes, because he was this big, very dark black man.
Okay.
So that kind of knee-jerk prejudice by me, who cares so much about it, you can imagine what other white people are dealing with. And we are raised just with the here's the way we're superior, which is that we are Americans. See, you're not American, you're black American. But we were raised to think of Americans as better than anybody else on the planet, and that always meant white Americans.
Okay. Excellent.
So that even in my family that had a self-consciousness about blacks, we were still raised to think America was the coolest country in the world. And guess what? That's whites.
And you said I love being white.
Well, I said I want to be white. I guess I did say I love it. I was being a little playful.
No, but it's all good.
But I wouldn't want to have to trade my place.
With me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's honest. Yeah. Daria, before we conclude this conversation, why is this conversation on white advantage so important? Why is it relevant, especially for today's generation?
Because folks keep talking about race as though it applies just to intentional racism, things that people do, failing to hire someone because of their name or the color of their skin, the old style racism that definitely dominated in the 60s and before, and people have yet to really take on questions about the fact that the black unemployment rate has been double that of whites for ages, and differences with regard to wealth. Black and Latino families earn 7 and 10 cents on the dollar. That's not the income disparity, that's the wealth disparity. But nobody talks about it because the conversation has really been captured to white people's benefit by this old-fashioned formulation of race that really gets us nowhere in terms of how race and racism has mutated in the 21st century.
And what are you hoping to accomplish with your book? I mean, what is it that's your message? What are you hoping to inspire?
Well, first I want to start a conversation about structural advantage and structural disadvantage. And so the book is really just a jumping off point to start that conversation and the events that surround the book. And by the way, I'll take this opportunity to plug, there's a book celebration event at the USC Fisher Museum on October 24th, starting at 7 p.m., and everyone is welcome to come. We have a panel of distinguished guests to talk about the book. But those conversations, I think, are crucial for us to really take on the kind of structural issues that I've been discussing. But then also to get policymakers to think about ways to remedy this. We were going to talk about remedies. One might be baby bonds.
Okay.
So there's a scholar by the name of Sandy Darity who proposes that children of low wealth, and that will be disproportionately black and Latino kids, but children of all races who are low wealth get a certain amount of money when they're born. This actually happened in the UK for a while. And that money gets put into an account, and then they don't touch that account. Parents can contribute, and maybe the government matches those contributions. And then they can withdraw from that account for housing, purchases, for college tuition, and for retirement. And in some ways, it's a trust fund that reproduces the kind of advantage that whites have enjoyed without even thinking about it for the past decades.
And you said this was employed where?
It was in the UK. They ran it for about 5 years. Every baby got 500 pounds or 700 pounds if they were needy, and then another infusion of cash when they were 7. But they dismantled that program about 2 or 3 years ago.
But do you really... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you really think that that could get voted in unless people also deal with their racism?
Well, Hillary Clinton was arguing for baby bonds the first time around during 2008. Let's see if she re-raises the conversation. But she was talking about money that really couldn't make much of a difference, like $500 to start.
Yeah. Okay.
Although every little bit helps.
I'm just worried.
I do think if you pitch it as a low wealth,
okay,
then race doesn't enter the conversation as much. And
except
we're
that's
all
become
about
code
inequality
for black.
these days, right? Occupy Wall Street and politicians are using inequality as a springboard for their political campaigns on the left and the center left these days. I think it's a very viable possibility.
So, but do you really think white America is ready to give up their advantage?
Well, if you paint this as something that is targeted at low wealth as opposed to people of color, then I think there's a significant cross-coalitional possibility where you unite poor and working-class whites with black and Latinos and Asian groups who are also at a wealth disadvantage, and that's the majority of the U.S. population. The other thing I'll say is I think there is a white investment advantage in thinking about this.
Right.
If we are going to be people of color collectively, and I know that's problematic to think about it that way, are going to be collectively in the majority in 2042, whites are going to need people for their labor pool and to buy their stuff. And if that group is underemployed or unemployed and is low wealth, that means no markets and no labor pool. So there's a white advantage to be maintained in some way by thinking about this.
Because we are consumer friendly. We are shopping.
Right. But I want to say this thing about giving up white advantage, I think, misses the point because it's not a zero-sum game.
Okay.
The problem, I think, is that as long as all this working to create more possibilities for wealth for newborns, for instance, by having them grow up with something that grows over time. If it's posed even as for people who are currently economically disadvantaged, it really has to be posed in a way that the picture black is not what dominates these white lawmakers' minds. But if that can be done, I don't think we have to worry about, quote, white advantage, because it's not a zero-sum game.
But you guys both are very, pessimistic as to if this would even happen in our lifetime.
I am pessimistic.
And you're pessimistic because?
Because, well, I think the structural inequalities that Daria is talking about, since they potentiate themselves with each generation, are going to be very hard to overcome. That's one thing. And the other is I'm not so optimistic that racism is going to disappear. And as long as people who are racist can vote, we got a problem.
Right. Daria, what are your thoughts?
I think Liz Warren is as popular as she is because there's a populist movement afoot that's now, there's an opportunity now like there's never been an opportunity. I think Liz Warren, Occupy Wall Street, and Thomas Piketty's work getting as much attention as it has among certain elite circles. But the conversation about inequality is one that is dominating political campaigns these days. And to the extent that we can mobilize that conversation on behalf of Latinos, blacks, and Asian groups, then I think we all benefit. I agree it's not
and
a
poor
zero-sum
whites.
game.
You got to add poor whites in
You have
there.
to talk about it in the right way.
Yeah.
Talk about labor pools. Talk about consumers to buy your stuff.
So what level of conversation is that in order for people to heal? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, so I don't know that this is about healing so much as it is about restructuring.
Okay.
And
Fair
for
enough.
me, Lynn takes care of the healing, and
you take care of
and
our
you do
emotions.
the restructuring. Take care of the restructuring. And I'm frankly as focused on the restructuring as I am anything else.
Okay, and then and from a social political perspective, what does that look like from your work?
The restructuring means thinking carefully about how we distribute opportunities and resources through families, through neighborhoods, through social networks, and through institutions, and then coming up with things like baby bonds to restructure in a way that ends up giving everyone the potential for structural advantage and not just whites. You know, people ask me, well, what would be your ideal endpoint? Would you get rid of capitalism? And I said, well, you know, that would be my ideal endpoint, but that's never going to happen. So I would be happy if poverty and wealth were evenly distributed with regard to race, without regard to race. So there were no disproportionately poor people of color and disproportionately wealthy whites. That would make me happy.
Excellent. And Lynn, with your work, what do you hope to accomplish? And your message, what are you looking to achieve?
Well, again, since I'm working on the psychological level, there's two things. One is I want white people to start seeing people of color as individual subjects instead of the objects that they pass by on the street or worse, okay? And the other is I want to affect them enough that it will affect how they vote.
Okay.
For things like the baby bond.
Okay. All right. And so your message mostly is for, you know, white people, but as a black person, you know what I mean, what is that message for me? I mean, how can I take what both you and Anthony are saying and, like you said, talk about this strategic advantage?
Yes. I mean, to me, the more you understand about the subtleties both structurally and psychologically of white advantage, the more strategic you'll be able to be in approaching people like me, that is white people, to get access to things that you can't get access to otherwise.
Okay, and so how will I appeal to your advantage if I'm trying to get something from you, or if I'm trying to get access to your network?
You don't appeal to my advantage directly, but you learn how to talk to a white person well.
Okay.
You know?
All right.
Like I'm thinking about conferences where they're mostly whites and a few blacks. Like a philosophy conference, there's this guy George Yancey who is a philosopher, black philosopher who writes about this, and he's uncomfortable because he's around all these whites, so he can't act the way he ordinarily does. He has to act like a white philosopher in order to be heard, and he's good at it. I want to teach us whites, when we're at white conferences, to be equally uncomfortable with the fact that we're comfortable leaving him uncomfortable.
You also said you wanted, in terms of some of your patients, when they are experiencing or when they recognize that they are receiving or benefiting from some white privilege or white advantage, that you say, and what do you say? And I get that because I'm white?
Yes. Oh, not just patients, but anybody when I'm teaching this stuff. I want them to, whether they're just crossing the street or buying something or asking for help, to finish that thought to themselves, like I'm crossing the street now and I'm white. Okay. Because I get to cross the street unself-consciously.
And what benefit is that to them to be able to recognize that?
Because then they get it, that there are other people in this culture who end up having to have that double consciousness all the time, which is a strain on them. And that has to do with wanting things to be equal. If I can have a double consciousness along with you, I'm more likely to see you as a person in your own right, not just an object.
Excellent. Daria, thank you so much for joining us. We do have your flyer up for your book signing.
Oh, great.
And that's, you said it's on the 24th, correct?
Yes, at the Fisher Museum at USC, starting at 7.
Okay, and how can people, if they want to contact you, how can they find you?
I have a website, DariaRoythMeyer.com, DariaRoythMeyer.com. Look for me on the faculty website at USC Law School if you can't remember, if I went too fast. And you'll find me there, and then use my name to go to the website. And I'm contactable on Facebook and Twitter as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us for this entire hour and a half. Your contribution has been absolutely invaluable. And good luck with your book.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this. This is a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Lynn.
And I hope to meet you, Doria. And I hope you guys connect, because we're all about networking here. So hopefully you connect. So thank you. And you said your next, Lynn, your next project, you want to talk about reparations.
Yeah.
You just are cruising for a bruising, boy. White people will never let you back in. You might as well come on over to our side, girl.
I think I'm being sent over to your side.
But tell me about your new research that you want to do.
So I want to look at white people's resistance to the conversation about reparation, which is another way to talk about helping white people deal with their guilt, because they're reluctant to look at reparations because they know they would be mourning forever, recognizing that everything they do in their lives is built on the fact that we've never had to make reparations, so we haven't had to sacrifice anything to repair what black folk have lost over all these generations.
So it's interesting that you want to have a conversation about reparations, and I don't even think we would want to have a conversation about reparations.
Black folk don't even?
I don't think so. I don't think we talk about reparations.
Why not?
I think we know we can't get nothing back. We lost our 40 acres in the mill a long time ago.
But you don't even want to try to talk about the conversation to wake white people up about the fact that this disproportionality still goes on?
I think we do, but we have so many black men incarcerated and our leaders in jail. I mean, we have so many other inequities that reparations, I think, is low on the totem pole. But it's interesting that you want to have this conversation. I'd be interested to hear what type of reaction you get when you ask white folks about giving black folks money back.
Yeah. Did you ever read? Did you read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in the Atlantic about it?
I didn't. I wasn't familiar.
You
can
find it online. No, you got to read that. It's an amazing article.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us again. What's the article?
It's called, I think, reparations, or the word reparations is in it. So if you go to the Atlantic website and punch in reparations,
Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates.
Okay, so we're going to...
you spell it. Yeah, you pronounce it differently. Do you know that that's the correct pronunciation? Because I don't. Okay. Ta-Nehisi Coates.
All right, very good. So we're going to... Thank you so much for that referral. We're going to check it out and talk about it here on the Dialogue, hopefully in the next couple of weeks when we continue our conversation on white privilege in America. How can people find you?
I have a website, lynnjacobs.com, LYNNEJACOBS, but it's a boring website. You can also just email me at lmjacobs@mac.com. My website's boring because it's for therapists.
Do you see black patients?
Yes, of course.
Okay, yes. Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to be here.
And thank you so much, Daria, for joining us on the call. And you can find her at USC Law School. And Professor Jody Armour, who had to leave early. We're going to continue our conversation on white privilege next week with our dialogue on white privilege in education. And then we're going to conclude on the 29th talking about the hip-hop industry. And we know we've seen a change in the music industry as it comes to white people and rapping, if you saw the BET Awards last night. So I am signing off. Starlett Quarles, this is the Dialogue, Real Talk, Real People. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I'm signing off as my mama's child and my daddy's baby girl. Until next week, God bless you.
staff and host of LA Talk Live would like to thank you for choosing the internet's hottest destination for the most eclectic sound and invigorating talk. This is LA Talk Live. We are more than just talk.